Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Presenting Our Presence. Presenting Our Presence is a podcast at the University of Alberta where we amplify the voices of Indigenous employees. So you get an opportunity to meet some of the amazing individuals, First Nation, Inuit, and Métis, who work at the University of Alberta. We hear about their passions and their uh, research and the work that they do and how they contribute to building the University of Alberta and how we support students. This morning, I welcome our guest for the day and co-host Michelle Durocher. Michelle, if you could introduce yourself this morning, as I don't think you've had the chance to meet our guest previously, then we'll move into having the conversation with our guest. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Florence. It's nice to meet you, Sarah. I'm Michelle Durocher. I'm from the Fishing Lake Métis settlement. And here in the University of Alberta, I work in the President's office. I am the Executive Operations Coordinator in this office, and I've been here about almost 2 years in this office, and at the university for about 15 years. So been around a while, and I'm really excited to speak with you today to hear more about your story and your work. And I'd love to turn it over to you now, introducing yourself in the way that's meaningful to you, and to get our conversation started.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Florence. Well, Latasquequin, Sarah Nicol and Scrulis, Titikamloops Esta Equin, Elfna St. Albert Namuntwin. Good morning. I'm Sarah Nicol. I'm a member of Tikakamloops to Secwepemc from the interior of British Columbia. I live in St. Albert, just north of us here, and I'm so grateful to live and work in these beautiful Treaty 6 territories, Métis Region number 4. I'm grateful to be part of this incredibly diverse and robust university community where on these lands where I'm a guest. I am Secwepemc on my mother's side. I belong to the Oxime Xavier line of our 13 grassroots families in Kamloops. Our family names also include the Doucettes and Dillabos, Mitchells, Celestas, and Jules. I'm also French Canadian on my mother's side. My grandfather has roots in the Trois Rivières region in Ile d'Orléans, back to Acadia and then to Normandy. I'm Ukrainian on my father's side. My grandfather left Ukraine when he was about 3 years old in the mid-1920s, first traveling to Mexico, where the family thought it might be warmer than Canada, which they heard was kind of chilly, before finally making their way up to Manitoba and then to the Fraser Valley of British Columbia. My life has also been full of movement. So I grew up kind of in between the mountains of northern Secwepemcúlecw, or our Secwepemc territories, in the very small town of Valemount, BC, in the mountains, and between there and the bustling metropolis of Richmond, BC, in the lower mainland. Like many academics, I've moved along with my studies and faculty positions, mostly across Western Canada, before arriving at the University of Alberta in the height of the pandemic in September 2020, in the History, Classics, and Religious Studies department. And before that, I had spent 5 years in the Indigenous Studies department at the University of Saskatchewan. I'm a mother to a beautiful, fierce, creative 5-year-old girl who just started kindergarten, so that has been a real adventure for us. I have a wonderful partner and a very large and full extended family, mostly living in the Western Canada, mostly BC, Alberta, a little bit region. And that's me.
That's wonderful. It's so wonderful to meet you, Sarah. One of the things that I was curious about when you said you've been here in the faculty just since the pandemic, what is your position like here starting at that time? How has that adjustment been? What kind of work do you do here?
Yeah, it was very odd. I mean, when I had the job offer, we still thought the pandemic wouldn't last for very long. So it was like spring, the shutdown had just happened. And so we thought, okay, well, let's just maybe postpone the appointment from July to September because that's going to fix everything. That would be fine. So arriving, when no one's really around, we had to buy a house and move with all the kind of COVID protocols, find daycare and all that kind of stuff for our young child. And then coming to a department where we were online, so meeting people virtually was difficult, but I could still sense even through that this department that was a really robust community, and I felt very welcome. So many people reached out to me to give me tips on the city or just see how I was doing. I taught one semester online, and then because of I'd spent 5 years at the University of Saskatchewan. The University of Alberta was wonderful and honored my sabbatical timeline that I'd planned. So then I went on sabbatical. So in many ways, it feels like I didn't fully arrive here until, like, I want to say maybe 2022, 2023. And since then, I've really felt at home. The department here is really wonderful. There are so many Indigenous and non-Indigenous colleagues across campus. The Faculty of Native Studies are many folks that I knew from the University of Saskatchewan before they all came up here. So yeah, it's a really wonderful place and a really wonderful student community I've found, teaching Indigenous focused courses in the history department. I get some really wonderful, keen, smart students that are, doing some really great work. So that's been lovely.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah. And now I understand that there is a new book about to come out, and I'm looking at the posters behind you. And the posters, I think, align with some of the themes that are also in the book around Indigenous women
Yep.
and leadership and activism, I believe. Could you
Yes,
tell us more about that book?
I would love to.
Thank you.
Yeah, so this book is something that I have been working on. Well, really, it started in probably about 2010 in my kia'a, my grandma's living room in Kamloops, where I was working on my first book project or dissertation at the time on the history of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, which was a pan-tribal Indigenous organization that started in the late 60s in British Columbia. And I was interviewing my grandfather, who was the chief at the time that the union was created, and just talking to him about that experience. And then my aunties and other women in the room started talking about all the other things they were doing. And, some like developing formal political organizations and women's organizations, but also doing other kind of cultural revival things, language revival, care for children. And I thought, oh, okay, this is my next project. This book, these ideas deserve a book of their own. And so I've spent the last, ever since then, traveling around Western Canada, interviewing Indigenous women who were involved in any kind of way during, about the 1960s to 1980s, doing political leadership, kind of social activism work. And to do that work, I really had to take quite a broad definition of politics, or like push at the boundaries of what people think politics consists of, including Indigenous women and what they think politics consists of. And so I heard stories about women just doing what needed to be done was what I heard a lot. We were just doing what needed to be done. They were starting Indigenous-run daycares and foster homes and intervening into foster care and child welfare policy and starting women's shelters and halfway houses, as well as starting really robust provincial and national political organizations like the Voice of Alberta Native Women's Society and Indian Rights for Indian Women. And so this book that is, it's been in peer review for a long time. It's like slowly coming out. It should be out, early 2025, I'm hoping. I've titled it Active Women, Indigenous Women's Social and Political Work in Canada as West. And I define West as Alberta, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia, both as a way to kind of highlight Indigenous women's understandings of place and seeing the connections that were really clear and really robust across those spaces, to push back against the idea that we're either in the prairies and we exclude BC, or BC is a thing of its own, just to kind of push back against some of those regional definitions according to women's own practices and understandings. And so that's where that's taken me. And so the book is, I had to cut it down quite a bit. It started at about 700 pages. And that I feel like was just grazing the surface of all the things that Indigenous women were doing. And so I cut it down to a modest 500 pages. And I think that that's probably part of the issue of peer review taking so long, is that it's a huge book. And it's such a partial book, but I'm hoping it's something that is going to really showcase all the different things that women were doing without the resources, without the support in lots of cases, against all odds, from their own communities, from their own men at times, certainly from the settler state, to make their lives and the lives of their families and communities better in whatever way they could. And that hopefully other people will take up that work, see other people like, oh, my granny should be in this story too, and then continue that work on.
Yeah, that's really powerful. I mean, so I'm assuming, given that you've identified a period of time that you have stayed, given the origins of the book, is that correct?
Yeah, so I tried to stay within, like, I do creep into the 1950s because I thought that some of the Indian homemakers clubs were really important for politicizing Indigenous women, that these were clubs that were started by the Department of Indian Affairs. They were really run and overseen by the settler women's societies. But then Indigenous women were smart and keen and realized, like, well, if we're talking about things like improving reserve conditions and, making our domestic lives better, we actually need changes to policy. We need better housing conditions, and we need sanitary services on our reserves. And so they started to lobby to government, and Indian Affairs obviously wasn't too keen on that. But then they mobilized and changed a lot of their homemakers clubs into some of these, like the BC Indian Homemakers Association became a very strong political organization in British Columbia. Many members of the homemakers clubs in Alberta went on to be involved in the Voice of Alberta Native Women's Society and Indian Rights for Indian Women. And so I do creep back into the 50s, 40s to kind of show that. And I try not to go too far beyond the kind of 1980s. Just to have an ending point, really, but also because, like, the status issue, there was that really key point of obviously not a full resolution of Indigenous women losing their status, but that key moment of change that enabled these later legislative changes and changes to the Indian Act and reduction of sexism in Indian Act policies to be started. So yeah, I do try to stay kind of in that region of, really powerful. It's a really powerful era for social mobilization, political mobilization in general. And I really want to showcase that Indigenous women were at the heart of that, even if in classic political histories and classic Canadian histories, and even, Indigenous histories, we don't see that. We should see that.
Yeah, that's just so powerful. It also reminded me, as you were sharing about some of the ways, like women just doing it, these Indigenous women just doing it. It also took me back to some of the understandings that I have around residential schools, where how in First Nation, Inuit, Métis women would find ways to work within the schools to at least have some understanding or some support for the children that were there. Right. And so that is my understanding. And so I just love it. Like, they just get on with, this is the work that needs to be done. So let's do it.
Yeah. And I think really it's very much a strengths based story. It's very much like I focus on that resilience, that activism, that resistance, But obviously the undertones of you can't have resilience in the face, for caring for children without acknowledging the overrepresentation of children in the child welfare system and the residential school system. And so seeing how Indigenous women took whatever moments or opportunities that they had to act. And that's sort of where the first part of the title of the book comes from. Active women. They were active, and they were active while they were, working outside the home for wages, doing unpaid work inside the home. Like, it's not that they were just doing activism work. It wasn't paid work. It was work on the sides of their lives, on the sides of their desks, often with their children, with them under the table, sleeping while they did grant applications to start a daycare. And I think the personal cost, is something that I tried to showcase as like, this was sacrifice, like this wasn't easy. And yet, I don't want to dwell on those kind of deficiency narratives. So it's really about kind of highlighting and showcasing that women did this in spite of all the context around and the conditions that they were operating in, which to me is just I feel so humbled every time I get to speak with women. And of course, part of this research took part over COVID. And so when we thought that it was going to be short, I just put a pause on oral interviews and visits. And then when things opened up a little bit, I thought, okay, well, maybe we can do some Zoom and some telephone stuff. But it really changed the way that I engaged and that, many of us engaged with our communities and our elders and got to meet people and hear stories. It was a bit different, but still so powerful. And I'm so humbled by all the women that I got to meet and talk to, as well as acknowledging the women that several women passed away before I got to formally interview them. So we just got phone conversations. Several women have passed on since. Several women are in their elder 90s, like, just like very, very elder women that have never told their stories because nobody ever asked. And I just think, the weight of that, but also the privilege of that is just wonderful.
I have more thoughts around this work, but Michelle, I invite you to share any wonders. Thank you, Sarah, for this. This is exciting work.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for giving me a moment there because I did get a little emotional with that last bit. So one of the questions that I had, you're talking about this process of going out and doing these interviews. What is that process like? How are you finding the resources, the people to talk to? Because when I think back to like this kind of activism in my own community, it's like I know which women I'm talking about. But if you're talking about going across provinces and everything, how are you finding all of these amazing stories and all of these amazing women to talk to share their story?
Yeah, that's a great question. That was one of my biggest worries and fears as somebody from British Columbia. Like, I had an an insight into some of the women in British Columbia, including my own family members, to talk to. But of course, even in BC, there's 204 First Nations, like that. I belong to one. So building off of the people that I knew and then listening to them talk about all the connections that they'd made and people that were around and that I should talk to. So that gave me some insights. When I moved to Saskatchewan, then it was connecting with some organizations and individuals. So I connected with FSIN and the Women's Secretariat there to meet some of those women and hear about some of the connections that they might have where we could kind of engage in a mutually beneficial way. Sometimes it was, archival records. So going through archival records, the one benefit I would say of, Indigenous people being so written about and talked about in archival and administrative records is that you often get names of people. Indigenous women and their organizations have their own records that are now, some of them are in archives. So, sometimes there'd even be phone numbers and addresses that were still the same that I could just call people up. So it was a lot of that reaching out, relationship building, the dreaded cold call where you say, hi, this is who I am. I know this about you. Would you be willing to talk to me? Which is terrifying, but also amazing. It was amazing that, the only resistance I ever got was, well, I don't really know if I'm important enough, or I wasn't really involved in that reluctance, which really trends across Indigenous women and helps to explain in a lot of ways, like why we don't know a lot of their stories, because they don't want to come off as being, grandiose about their accomplishments. They really undermine that. And so a lot of my work was convincing women that, yes, I do want to hear your story, from individuals who were presidents of associations to people who just did some work, and just got involved for whatever reason, whether it was lifelong or not. So yeah, that was a really interesting part, finding women, convincing women. Often children and family members would play a role in convincing their mothers, grandmothers that, yeah, you have to do this interview. We want to hear this story. Especially when as part of my practice, I always gift back the interviews to the families, to any band councils or museums that they would like to have those records, because it is about letting your family know the story that maybe you haven't told them. So yeah, it's a little bit of all the strategies.
Did you find it difficult to get women to talk? Because we do have that I don't know what it is, if it's like built in, or if it's just this sense of like, downplaying our roles in society and in our communities and stuff. That whole, I just did what I had to do. I just did what we were like, just that humility, I guess.
Humility, absolutely. Yeah, I think when I finally would convince the reluctant ones to talk, to meet, or have a phone interview, often you could hear their excitement when I would start to ask about things that I did know about already. So, like those kind of targeted questions about, oh, I encountered you in this newspaper article where you were part of this protest, or where you cornered a minister of housing to grill them on the conditions of Indigenous housing in Regina, and their voice or their eyes would light up, and then I think it's like, then they felt valued, probably, that this was something like I was genuinely interested in hearing about, and that usually worked. But yeah, it was still through the interviews, often those prying is a bad word, but like just trying to excavate those stories out. And I think a lot of them too is, it was about what's the purpose of doing this work? And I think that's something that as Indigenous scholars, we're always forward about, that, why am I doing this work? Why is it important to me? What connection do I have to it? And where's it going to go? And what's it going to be used for? And so being really forward about, this book is about elevating people's stories. It's about being able to have families and communities, as well as the broader public, to understand these histories and see them as important, to be able to give other Indigenous scholars or others that launch point to see, oh, okay, like my grandma's here, but there's just a really small portion about her. So I'm now going to take this history and see what I can do with it. I think that really spoke to them, because of course they're all doing this work for those future generations, for their children and grandchildren and beyond. And so I think for a lot of them that did speak to them as something that they could offer.
So my curiosity, so I have two curiosities.
Yep.
One of them was there a particular story? You talked about how this project was initiated when you were working on your dissertation, and you heard your aunties and your grandmother, I think, speak, or other women in the family. Was there a particular story that stood out for you in the interviewing of all of these amazing women that you would like to share, or that has lingered with you, as you move forward in your life as a woman, that has really resonated with you?
Oh gosh, so many, but I'm going to share two short ones. The first one was, and this is actually motivated my one of my next projects, was talking with a relative, Muriel Sisakamoose, who was part of the BC Native Women's Association in British Columbia, with her mother, Mildred Gottfredson, and Mildred was really well-known activist. She was really at the forefront of creating the BC Native Women's Society. She had a cultural dance troupe that she led and toured around the world. She was part of our cultural kind of revival reclamation society. So just like a really powerful, important woman. And so I was chatting with Muriel to interview her about her role, and also Mildred's, because Mildred passed on before I was born. And she was telling me about my own great grandmother, Tessie Dillabo, and how part of the work that they were doing for the status issue was about bringing women like my grandmother home. So my great grandmother grew up on the reserve, then married out, the classic story. And so to hear stories about that personal connection, it was about these women who had status. Muriel and Mildred never lost their status. They always got to live on reserve, but they were concerned about their sisters and their cousins coming home. And I still get goosebumps when I think of that, because that's her speaking directly to me and to my family, and to know that was something that was a personal connection, but also that's true of all the women they were fighting for, was incredibly powerful. That they didn't lose sight of the individual women who had to leave their communities because of marriage choices, and that they were fighting for them and fighting hard and against all odds for that. So that really stuck with me. And then the other story is about Northern Saskatchewan. And I interviewed Mary Heimbecker. She was one of the women that started the Larange Native Women. And it started, so this was a local of the Saskatchewan Native Women's Movement, but it didn't start as a local, it started as a daycare. And so what happened was Mary moved to Larange and was connected with a couple women there, including Marge Beeman. And Marge Beeman was one of the women that unfortunately passed away before I got to formally interview her. But when Mary arrived in town, Marge said, "You know what we need? We need a daycare. Let's have a meeting. We need to figure this out." And so Mary's like, "Okay, like, I'm new to this community. I'll see what I can do." And at this meeting, she was voluntold to be the director, the creator of this daycare. And she said, I had no idea what I was doing. I had no experience. She had care over some of her grandchildren at the time, so she did need help in taking care of them. But it was other community children. That meant parents couldn't work for wages. They couldn't do traditional hunting and gathering practices, and so she was just sort of thrust into this role. And she and Marge created this daycare. And once they created the daycare, they found a building to rent. Mary said, we learned as we went. I realized partway through, I had all these little signs up, and I realized, oh, they're too tall for these kids. Like, I have to actually put things down at eye level. We need furniture that is child-sized. When the kids were cranky one day, that's when she realized, oh, we have to feed them. So she sent someone to the store to get bread and eggs, and this learning as she went. And it was once they started to figure things out and realized, okay, we might need funding or we might need help, they connected with the Saskatchewan Native Women's Movement to create the Larange Native Women's chapter, so that they had that kind of structure to help them do that work. And so they created that daycare. Then they created a longstanding, still running women's shelter, and other initiatives from that. But I love that story because it's such a clear example of people being thrust into these situations where they feel like they have no skills, no experience to actually be successful, and they just do the work, and then it turns into something really amazing. And so it's that reluctance, it's that, just truly grassroots work, that has a really long history and legacy, that, people in the ranch, they still talk about this daycare. Everybody knows who Mary and Marge are, their scholarships in their name. It's just like one of these really wonderful stories that started haphazardly. And I think because Mary said yes, And I think that's the difference, is like women just kept saying, yes, I'll give it a shot. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'll give it a shot. And I find that so inspiring.
It is truly inspiring. And I'm thinking of just some of the stories that have been told in my own family about the women and how even I sometimes say, oh, I can't help who I am. It's my ancestral women that are here. This is part of the work we do. And what I find so interesting is you shared this work is, as universities in create positions similar to the position I'm in right now as vice provost. Um, when you look across this place called Canada, most of these roles have women sitting in them. So we are these Indigenous women who, and there's a variety of reasons, but that is so interesting to me because we are that legacy of our ancestral women are still live out, I think, today in, in the work that's happening at universities, because in lots of ways we have to be activists.
Yes, yes. And we never let go of that. And I think you're absolutely right. Like I like to think of activism in terms of generations, and not necessarily like age-based generations, but these kind of eras. And I think you're absolutely right. This era that we're in, that I think historians down the road will research and come and interview all you folks about, what motivated you to take these positions up? What made you say yes? And what made you stick with it too? Because we also know in a lot of these positions, they're not easy. And you all are really the trailblazers of figuring out what this could look like, working for communities, for Indigenous people in the same way that generations before us did, right? I think that's so empowering. That's so interesting.
Yeah, it truly is. And I know it's been really interesting because there have been some doctoral students who have started to do this work already on what is it like to be an Indigenous woman in these roles. And I'm thinking about one of the studies that I participated in. And again, like I told the stories of these aunties that have been in my life, and my grandmother and my great grandmother, my mother, who were just these really strong Métis women who just did it. Like there was never, so I really appreciate hearing about this work that you've done, Sarah.
Oh, thank you. I feel like it is, it's one of those things where it's a conversation starter because everybody has these stories, and that's really my hope. That's what allows me to, send this book off and say, okay, like I have to stop, like I have to get these stories out because it's so partial. Like I have women that are still contacting me from, me contacting them years ago saying, okay, now I'm ready. And so it's absolutely incomplete. And I think, yeah, I can't wait for more people to take up this work and just, record these stories and share them.
So, Sarah, you said that the first story that you shared that lingers with you has also prompted your next project. So I wonder if, as we come nearing the end of our time together, if you might share what the next project is before we say thank you.
Yes, of course. Yes. So this was prompted by my interview with Muriel Sasakamoose about her mother's work. And she said, no one has ever written anything about her. And I said, oh, okay, well, let's do it. Let's change that. And so, yeah, we're working on a book together about like a biography of Mildred Gottfredson from the family community perspective. So the idea is, to interview family members, community members, go into the archives, and then hear all of Muriel's stories about her mother. So present that into a book, but also hopefully a museum exhibit. So Kamloops we're really lucky in that we have like a museum and cultural center that is under renovation right now, but will be opening soon, where I'm hoping to have an exhibit about Mildred and her work, because I think it's so it's so impactful, not only for our community, but beyond.
I'll turn it over to Michelle for any final words, and then we'll invite you, Sarah, to close off in whatever way is most comfortable for you. Thank you.
Thanks, Florence. Yeah, Florence and I are on the same page today. I was also going to say, oh, what about this next project? So that's awesome. So thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you for your time today. It's so wonderful. And it, like Florence said too, it makes me think of the women in my life and what they have done and how, even looking at it myself, I didn't really think about it as activism, because it was just what they were doing. It's just what mom did. That's what mom did. That's what, like, my aunties did. But now I'm like, okay, I can see where maybe where it's built in from me, because that's kind of what I did through high school as well, was, well, I'm just going to do it because no one else is doing it, so I'll just do it. And so I think it's just, generational. It's just going through us, right? And it just becomes a part of our history, and then we pass that along to our future. So thank you so much for sharing all of that today. It really makes you think, and I'll go away thinking about all of that. So thank you so much. Hi.
Oh, well, thank you both so much. This is such a wonderful thing that you do to enable us to have a platform to share our work and share excitement in different ways than we often get to in academia, where I think we all try to, do community presentations or share work in blogs and that kind of thing. But this is a really powerful forum. And so I really appreciate you inviting me and giving me the chance to geek out on the things that I'm really excited about.
Well, it was truly an honor to have you with us today, Sarah. We wish you success, and we look forward to hearing when that book is available for us to read, about these strong ancestral women who have shaped the spaces for us to be. And when I look across the three of us, I mean, we're in spaces where they weren't built for us. And here we are. And we are presenting our presence. So thank you. Thank you.
Both.